Good morning, civics class. First, I'll start off by saying I continue to miss you. I wish you were all here and we were all together working as a team. This is our last video. More than likely, I won't film another one. This should take us all the way through to the end of May. I don't know when you're going to see this video, but the question has been coming up. I have been getting the question, hey, when is the year over? The end of May. June starts summer vacation. So you got roughly, I'm filming this at the end of April, so we, at this point, have roughly a month left of school. All right, chapter 25, lesson 3. We're going to continue our study of the United States and its relationship with other nations and global issues and global problems. To solve global issues and global problems, we've talked about the idea that we have to work together as a team. We're going to work with governmental and non-governmental organizations to solve some of these problems and work our ways through them. We'll also have things like military and defense alliances, most famously like we talked about NATO, etc. We're going to be covering some of these same things again. But we're going to sum up our ideas about how America has to work with others. What are some global problems, and are these things America just can ignore, or are these things America's government is forced to address? All right, we'll start off with understanding and hopefully accepting that each nation has a different culture than any other nation. This doesn't mean that people are all completely different. Of course we're not. We're going to see, at a most basic level, people are pretty much the same. But when you get to a more specific level, each country has a different culture, different traditions, different religions, different foods, different ways they prioritize their lives. So, while nations have different cultures, we're going to see that when we look at people in general do share some traits, do share things that we're going to call human rights. Wherever you go, people want to live, and they want to live free, and they want to worship the way they choose, and they want to have some say in their government, and they have some say in the taxes they have. They want to marry who they want. They want to be safe and secure. They want to be able to buy things. They want to be able to start businesses. They're going to expect some level of health care, okay? So we're going to see nations band together in something called the United Nations, which we talked about, formed after World War II, to try to agree what these things are. What are human rights? What are things that all people deserve just by the mere fact that they're people? And this goes all the way back to the beginning of the year. Hobbes and Locke talk about the fact that all human beings have these things called natural rights. That these things are given to us at birth, not by a government. As Americans, we don't have rights because the United States government gives them to us like a dog treat. Oh, here's a right, you could vote. Oh, here's a right, you have free speech. No, these are things we all have immediately at birth. The government's job is to respect and protect those natural rights. So when we talk about human rights, we're really just going all the way back to Hobbes and Locke's ideas of natural rights. So, hopefully we agree, and most nations agree, that these things called human rights do exist. So the United Nations actually is going to try to write down, and we're going to actually put in a United Nations document what these human rights are. These human rights are important. These human rights are things we see in our lives. These human rights, again, trace all the way back to Hobbes and Locke. These things we fight for today are the same things we fought for during the Revolutionary War, okay? These ideas of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and property are internationally recognized as human rights. So, World War II ends in 1945. Countries look at this world with 60, 70, 80 million dead, Europe blasted flat, and say, how do we avoid this from happening again? One of the things they come up with, of course, is the United Nations. It's going to be an organization where all the nations of the world can come, send ambassadors or delegates, and try to work out problems without having World War III. The United Nations' major job is going to be international peace and preventing World War III. So they get the United Nations running shortly after World War II in 1948. Abby, since 1948, have there been wars?
Yes.
Have people killed each other?
Yes.
Are there horrible international problems like health scares and famine and refugees and terrorism and violence?
Absolutely.
So has the United Nations been able to end all these problems?
No.
But have we had a World War III?
No.
No. So a lot of people are very skeptical about the United Nations. They say it costs too much. It's useless. That's an opinion. You'll decide. But please, before you decide, do some research. We could hopefully agree upon the fact, though, that if the United Nations' main role is prevent World War III, they at least have been able to do that. And at the very least, the United Nations provides a venue, a space, a place where countries can meet together and attempt to work out problems, even if they're not uniformly successful. Okay. So the United Nations, when it's created, decides, hey, we got to create a charter. We got to list what we're here to do. And part of that is we got to come up with an idea of human rights. Because even though these things are generally agreed upon, when you actually try to write it down, you're going to have some minor arguments here or there. Particularly in 1948, when you have the United States, a major world power. Is the United States going to agree with the Soviet Union necessarily what universal human rights may look like?
Mm-mm.
Of course not. So the countries have to work through these disagreements, but they do come out with a product, and it's called the Declaration of Human Rights. And if you read your way through it, it's hard to argue with the things that are going to be in here. Article 1. All human beings are born, bless you.
Thank you.
All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. You're really going to argue about that? Be hard to argue about that. Article 2. All people should have human rights without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So we just saw 70 million people killed during World War II. We'll just talk about the 6 million Jews who were killed solely because of their ethnic group and their religion. Okay? So the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is kind of reinforcing the idea that, hey, look, this is unacceptable behavior. We should not have certain level of rights depending on who you are, what religion you are, what race you are, what gender you are. It is completely flat and equal and level for everyone. The rest of the articles have a lot of other detailed things in there. Please, it's in the textbook. It gives you a little more ideas, but it covers things like the right to own property and businesses. There's one that says you have a right to some level of health care. So all nations basically, free to marry who you choose, equal protection under the law. So there's a lot of things that you could recognize from our Bill of Rights are going to be in this UN document. Of course, things like slavery, universally condemned. Remember, slavery wasn't just something that was happening in the United States. Slavery was something that was a worldwide problem at parts of Earth's history, and some people argue that slavery still exists today. So, of course, things like slavery and prejudice and segregation, unacceptable in the UN's eyes as violations of human rights. Not everybody gets the message. Not everybody respects these things. So we talk about tyranny or repression or oppression. They all basically mean the same things. A tyrannical, repressive, oppressive government denies its own people these human rights. Of course, famous examples in the world right now today. North Korea is probably the biggest one you think of a government that represses or oppresses its people. There's only one legal party. You can only vote for one party. You can only vote for one person. You have to follow that government blindly. It denies you basic rights, simple things like being able to travel, leave the country, okay? So a North Korean, day to day, doesn't have a lot of protection of their rights. They pretty much got to do what the government says, or they get hauled off to a prison camp along with their family. And that's like, if they're lucky, they may just be immediately killed. Repressive regimes, how do they control their people? First, we already learned about propaganda. When you start training a kid 3, 4, 5, 6 years old to believe what you want them to believe, you could be pretty successful at that. When every TV, radio show, movie says your government is awesome and you need it to protect you from those Americans who are going to throw your babies down a well, it has an effect over time. And of course, a repressive regime doesn't just use propaganda, it also uses
like military force?
Military force and secret police, spies. So in North Korea, your neighbor's watching you and you're watching your neighbor. If your neighbor thinks you're doing something that's against the government, they'll tell the secret police. Secret police shows up in the middle of the night, throws a bag over your head, drag you away. Do you get a fair and speedy and public trial?
No.
Do you probably get a lawyer?
No.
Do you have a bunch of rights that are going to protect you? No. They throw a bag over your head, drag you away, drag your family away. You're in a prison camp, making little rocks out of big rocks. If you're lucky, if you're unlucky, they just execute you, okay? So North Korea is famous. But there's all types of repression, and there's all types of countries that don't respect people's rights. Saudi Arabia, which is a country basically we're friends and allies with, still very repressive regime. They have a religious-based monarchy. There's really no kind of free, easy, capable government opposition. And of course, they have some pretty strict laws. Here's an execution in Saudi Arabia, which they sometimes do in public by just lopping your head off right there in the middle of the square. Political cartoons. If you had taken your ESC, you would have got a political cartoon or two you had to interpret. So what do we see here, Abby? What do we think's going on? What country are we talking about?
Probably China.
Yeah, so you have the Great Wall, which is a hint that it's China. And also, just like we use Uncle Sam represents the United States in red, white, and blue, a lot of times you'll see China represented by a dragon, and typically it's going to be red because that's the color preferred by communist governments. So, a Chinese citizen, Liu Xiaobo, won the Nobel Peace Prize one year, and the Chinese government would not let that person get that prize. An example of what a repressive regime, a repressive government would do. China, for all the improvements made over time, still is not a country that respects its citizens' full civil human rights. Genocide. Repression is bad enough. What is genocide, Abigail?
Like the killing of a big group of people?
Sure. Genocide is the organized, planned, usually government-sponsored attempt to kill an entire ethnic group, race, or group of people. So, of course, famous genocides throughout history. Abby, do you know any genocides throughout history?
The Holocaust?
The Holocaust, of course, is the biggest one and the one that you know about the most. So from 1933 to 1945, Nazi Germany and its allies killed somewhere around 6 million people solely for the fact they're Jewish. But the Nazi regime also killed the Roma. Nazi regime killed homosexuals. Nazi regime killed handicapped people. They killed priests and religious authorities, etc. So a genocide is usually a government-sponsored or organized attempt to wipe out an entire ethnic group of people. But that's not the only genocide. Any other genocides you're aware of?
Wasn't like the KKK kind of like a genocide?
Oh, KKK was never big enough to organize and run a genocide, because genocides typically need a government to make that work. Nazi Germany was an entire government which had all the apparatus of a government to include police, military, etc., doing genocide. The KKK, even though at times it was big in America, never had the backing of the United States government. So the KKK, you'd think of more of like a organized terrorist group than a group that was capable of genocide. But some people argue that the United States early in its history did genocide against the Native Americans, because depending on who you listen to, some people say we killed millions of Native Americans through war, starvation, disease, and genocidal-like policies to eliminate Native Americans from the continent. There's a genocide in Armenia during World War I where the Turkish people killed a million Armenians. The one here we talk about and closest to us, time-wise, in Rwanda. Rwanda, very small country in Africa. There were two ethnic groups, the Tutsis and the Hutus. The ethnic group that ran the government said, hey, guess what? We got to wipe this other tribe out, this other ethnic group out, or they're going to take the country over. And they did. And they killed nearly 1 million people in a very short period of time. And not through like these organized ways like the Nazis did with concentration camps and gas chambers. They were able to kill 1 million their fellow Rwandan citizens just basically with shooting them and chopping them up with machetes, okay? Other attempted genocides near our current time frame was in Darfur, another place in Africa, in the country of Sudan. Islamic northern Sudan tried to kill southern Sudan, or southern Sudanese citizens. So genocide is about as big as a world global problem you could get. And the United Nations would be one of the organizations that would try to stop the genocide. So the United Nations is only one of the international organizations that you would hope exists to protect human rights. They're not just there to stop wars, but they're also there hopefully to stop genocide, but also any kind of repressive regime that takes human rights away from their citizens. You would hope that the United Nations does it. So they have their own office that's specifically geared towards protecting human rights. But there's also non-governmental organizations. For example, Amnesty International does not work for any organization. It's a private organization. What Amnesty International does basically is investigate. So if Amnesty International thinks the government is violating its citizens' human rights, they do interviews, they do investigative work, and then they publish it. They say, hey, this country is torturing their citizens. This country isn't giving people fair trials. This country executes people without a fair trial. So Amnesty International is a non-governmental organization trying to protect human rights. The United Nations is, of course, an international government organization trying to prevent human rights. So if the United Nations does think somebody is seriously violating somebody else's human rights, what can they possibly do? They can refer it to the Security Council. The Security Council are those big 5 powerful countries: United States, Russia, China, Great Britain, and France, who potentially can intervene to protect human rights using military force. It's possible. Does it happen often? No. Because do you think you could often get the United States, Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France to agree on things together? No. But there's potential that the United Nations Security Council can intervene in situations to protect people's human rights. Democracy. Many people would argue that democratic governments protect their people's human rights. if you are a citizen under a democratic government, you are more likely to have your human rights protected. Why might that be, Abby?
Because you can vote for them?
Exactly. If you're in a democracy, you, the citizen, you have power, popular sovereignty. So, if any government is violating my rights, I vote them out. I change that government. I act. So, since that tends to be the case, if you have more democracies on planet Earth, you have more protection of human rights, and you have other things too, like less war. So we go from very few democracies before World War II to the point where the majority of planet Earth are democracies, maybe not always well-functioning democracies, but the majority of countries are democracies. The United States would say that the spread of democracy is in the United States' best interest, and it helps the world by creating more protections for human rights and more opportunities for peace. Sound good?
Mm-hmm.
So, we're getting there. From the graph, you see the blues are your more democratic countries, and your reds are your more authoritarian countries. The more repressive countries with less human rights are going to be in your red. The more democratic countries with more human rights protections are in the blue. And you see, hopefully, what, in this point in your life, you already know. Of course, the United States, Western Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are your full up, usually pretty well functioning democracies that have respect for their citizens' rights and protections for human rights. Who struggles? Of course, the repressive autocracies like Communist Cuba, Communist China, Saudi Arabia. It's our ally because they have things like lots of oil, but it's a very repressive regime. In the middle, you have places like Russia, which this chart calls a anocracy. An anocracy is a government that says it's democratic, but is not functioning as a democracy. So you could vote in Russia, but the problem is the only person you typically get to vote for is Vladimir Putin. All right? They'll have another party, another candidate, but it's somebody who's running from the secret police, has no money, their offices get raided, the secret police spy on them, their poll workers get beat up. So it's a democracy if you read their constitution, but it's not functioning as one. Okay, there's really only one leader, Vladimir Putin. The chance you're going to vote him out. If you're very brave, you try to support that other candidate, but don't be surprised if the secret police doesn't start harassing you and maybe throw you in jail. And if they really don't like you in Russia, there's like this plague of people committing suicide. They're all like falling out of windows. That's how they do it these days. They make it look like a suicide. They're less likely to just shoot you in the back of the head like they did in the Soviet Union days. Now Vladimir Putin's goons will throw you out the window and say it was a suicide or an accident. Terrible. All right. This is really a result of the end of World War II. If you remember World War II, you had the United States, Britain, and countries like France fighting against Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan. So, World War II runs from 1939 to 1945. The sides, of course, the Allied powers, the good guys, we hope in our story, of course, the United States, Britain, France, China, the Soviet Union fighting against Germany, Japan, and Italy. World War II ends, the good guys, the Allies win. The Allies, at least Great Britain, France, and the United States, were democracies and capitalist countries. What's a capitalist economic system, Abigail?
Like
Well, we're a capitalist system. Who runs businesses?
people.
People do. In a capitalist system, Businesses are privately owned. I get money, I get a business plan, I create my own business. The government doesn't tell me what to do. Of course, Soviet Union was communist, which is the other side of the coin. In a communist system, among other things, the government runs all businesses and tells businesses what to do. So after World War II, the world splits in half, basically, with the capitalist nations, led by the United States, France, England, being the good guys again, against the communist nations, led by the Soviet Union. So countries start lining up capitalist, typically capitalist, democratic, freer countries on one side, and then communist, authoritarian countries, or countries they took over on the other side. So we create two defense alliances. US, Canada, Britain create this defense alliance called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Soviet Union and the countries it takes over creates a defense alliance called the Warsaw Pact. So this turns into something called it's a war.
The Red War, the Red Scare War.
Well, it's Red Scare. That was another term for we're afraid of communism. Was it a hot war or was it a...
Cold War.
Yeah, it's the Cold War. So from the end of World War II till about 1989 or 1991, we have this thing called the Cold War. It's called the Cold War precisely because the two major heavyweights weren't in actual shooting war with each other. The United States and its NATO allies face off against the Soviet Union and its communist allies, the Warsaw Pact, in a war of diplomacy, ideas, and little tiny brushfire wars around the world. So, in this, the book will talk about it, and I just want to mention it. Anybody who was anti-communist became sort of a good guy in our book. Even if there were countries that didn't respect their human rights and treated their people cruelly. So that's one of the things you got to think about from our perspective in the Cold War. The United States got to a point, unfortunately, well, they're like, yeah, this government is terrible. It represses and tortures their people, and they don't have a democracy there, but they're anti-communist, so guess what? They're not only our friends and allies, but we actually support them with troops and money, etc. So we have this war, a non-shooting war that goes on from 1945 to call it 89 to 1991, called the Cold War. So of course there is shooting, but it was in these little countries around the world, and it wasn't US troops fighting Soviet troops. We have, of course, one of the big wars of the Cold War, the war in Vietnam. The United States was fighting in the country of Vietnam against communists supported by Soviet Union and China. So US troops weren't fighting with Soviet soldiers or Chinese soldiers. They're fighting against Vietnamese backed by the Soviets or the Chinese. The Soviets' big war was in this place called, you've heard of it, Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and who helped the Afghan people fight the Soviets? The United States. So we gave the Afghan people all kinds of arms, weapon, money, and training to help fight the Soviet Union. So, Cold War, world split in half. NATO and the capitalist countries fighting the Soviet Union and the communist countries. Did they actually fight each other? No. Did we spy on each other? Yes. Did we use propaganda against each other? Yes. Did we try other things to fight against each other? Yes. Did we fight little small wars around the globe? Yes. But luckily, we never had a big war, Soviet Union against the United States, because that could have turned into a nuclear war, and then we would have got blasted flat, and we wouldn't be sitting at our homes, eating Takis, and playing on my Switch.
So like, why did the Cold War end? Like, how did it end? Because communism still, like, they're still communist countries.
Sure. We're going to get to that in the next slide. And it's complex because I said the Cold War lasted 45, 50 years with like the entire globe involved.
Yeah.
Some people will say the Cold War ended because, let's face it, capitalism is just that much better than communism. Communism doesn't work, and the Soviet Union was going to fall apart eventually, like it did. Other people say we just outspent them. NATO, and particularly the United States, we spent so much money on weapons. The Soviet Union tried to too, and it couldn't keep up. And as people started getting angry, and it fell apart. The direct cause, though, was the people living under Soviet Union and communist countries just got tired of their governments. They didn't have their human rights protected, and they looked around and they didn't get anything else either from their government. If I live in the United States, I have a chance to live my own life with my rights protected and a chance to make money and make my family happy. In the Soviet Union, you had none of those basic freedoms, and then if you wanted food, you had to wait in line at the one government department store, the one government grocery store. Then you get into the store and you're like, yeah, I'd like some eggs and milk. And they're like, nope, no eggs or milk today. Well, what do you have? I got Spam. Well, I guess I'm buying Spam. Could you buy a car in the Soviet Union? Sure. First you had to get on the waiting list, and it was like a 12-year waiting list to get a car. And then after 12 years, you finally get your car. You're like, yes, I got a car. And it's a horrible piece of junk. Okay? So over 50 years of that, the Soviet people and all those people in the Warsaw Pact are like, all right, let's see here. I have no rights. I can't vote for my government. I have restrictions on travel. And I can't buy anything. The government makes sure I have a job, which is nice, but I can't buy anything with it. I go to a line, I stand there for hours, and all I get is what the government has there today. You don't have that problem for whatever the flaws of capitalism are. I go to Target, there's plenty for me to buy. I go on Amazon, I can buy it pretty much, the world's at my fingertips. If you grew up in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, you got nothing and liked it. If they had beets, you ate beets. If they had Spam, you ate Spam. You wanted a car? Great. Get on a waiting list. And there's other problems too. If you were powerful and connected with the government in Soviet Union, did you move to the front of the line on the waiting lists?
Yeah.
Yeah. Were there special stores you could go to? And the people saw that too. They're like, I'm Joe Factory Worker. We're all supposed to be equal, but I'm eating Spam. I'm on a 10-year waiting list for a car. I live in a terrible apartment, but this guy over here is eating steak, driving a limousine. Did you read Animal Farm?
No, but I know what it is.
Read Animal Farm. So, what do we see here? 45 years is a long time. There's a lot of reasons why the Soviet Union crumbled. But a lot of historians, and I agree with them, think these two human beings were some of the ones that kind of broke the Soviet Union's back. That's President Ronald Wilson Reagan and Pope John Paul II. What? Ronald Reagan, of course, was the President of the United States. He focused on being very anti-Soviet. He built up our military. He constantly strengthened our NATO alliances. He was a very vigorous anti-communist. And some say Reagan's leadership during the 8 years of his presidency kind of was the last straw and really broke the Soviet Union. Pope John Paul II, head of the Catholic Church. Religion under communism is typically either completely illegal or controlled by the government. He was Polish by background. And he, with his connections in Poland, basically helped the Polish people rebel against the Soviet Union because the Poles were part of the Warsaw Pact. So, He helps Poland rebel, and they basically rebel successfully. So all the other people living under communism were like, hey, the Poles were able to do it. Why don't we? I'll show you one of the less graphic pictures. So these communist Warsaw Pact countries, the people just start rebelling. In Poland, it was over years. It starts with factory strikes and government protests. In Romania, it was fast. Romania was a communist country. They had a bunch of strikes and protests, and then they wound up just grabbing their president and the president's wife, and they put them against the wall. And what does it look like they did next?
Shot them.
Shot them up. It's a terrible thing, and we shouldn't laugh. They didn't get their rights protected. They didn't get a free trial. They basically were told, you're guilty, put against the wall, and some soldiers shot them up with AK-47s. All right? But over this 45 years, capitalism, NATO, and at the end of the game, people like Reagan and Pope John Paul II showed the Soviet Union they weren't going to win, showed people communism was a dead end, and showed people there was another way to live. You didn't have to stand in a line for 3 hours to get 2 left shoes, because that's all they had at the Soviet version of Target. Or a can of Spam and a beet, because that's all the food they had. Or you sit there, you're on your 10th year waiting list for a car, and you watch one of your government officials drive past you in a shiny limousine. So communism, Soviet Union basically explodes, falls apart, 89 to 91, starts really in Poland. Oh, this was something called the Berlin Wall. Germany was split in half, a communist side and a capitalist free side. When all these things started falling apart, people just started tearing this wall down. Big thing I remember in my history. That was a big historic event. So, Cold War ends, Soviet Union fractures apart into like 15 different countries, but you still have communism in places like Cuba, China, Vietnam. You have a communist-like dictatorship in North Korea, and you have Russia, which isn't communist anymore, but it's not really democratic. It's kind of this rogue, criminal, authoritarian state. But democracy was on the march, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union. Some of those parts that used to be the Soviet Union are functioning democracies today and have joined us in NATO. But did peace break out all over? Of course not. I was in the military when the Soviet Union falls apart, and that was going to be our big enemy. I trained in the beginning of a military career. I was going to fight the Soviets. I was going to fight a bunch of Soviet bombers and missiles and submarines, and that's what we were trained for. And then that threat just disappears. So we look at each other like, what are we going to do now? And unfortunately, it wasn't long until another threat comes up, global terrorism, global international terrorism. Of course, with the attacks on our own country in 9/11/2001, we don't have global peace and utopia, unfortunately. We change a world-threatening Cold War into a lower level, but still dangerous and bloody, war against terrorism. So what countries respect human rights and which countries don't? Which are the freest countries and which are some of the ones that are a little less than free? You can look at these charts. The things you want to look on are what countries protect your human rights. Which countries protect your ability to be an economic person, to have your own businesses, to buy and sell what you want? Which countries have real journalism and protect their journalists? Because if you don't have a free press, if your government is attacking your press, you're not going to be free. So what we typically see, and each chart is a little bit different, but the Western democracies like the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia and New Zealand are typically your free functioning countries. And the countries that struggle are your Russias, China's, North Korea's, and then a lot of countries in Africa basically are autocracies too, so they typically struggle with freedom. Any of those questions on any of that?
Mm-mm.
September 11, 2001, we taught a whole class on that earlier in the year, but let's review. A terrorist group called Al-Qaeda attacks the United States in New York City, the Pentagon, and Washington, D.C. with hijacked airplanes, which they basically fly kamikaze style into those targets. And of course, the fourth airplane that was hijacked. The passengers, by this point, are finding out what's going on. They know what's going to happen. They're not just going to be held for ransom somewhere. They're going to be flown into a building. So the passengers attack the terrorists, and basically the plane crashes into a field in Pennsylvania. So that kicks us off in this next big struggle, this next big undeclared war the United States is going to fight. So, how does this impact the United States? We know, we're going to get into wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and many other places around the world. But there's other things too. We talked about cabinet, and the newest cabinet department is the Department of Homeland Security. What do you think they're supposed to do?
Protect your homeland.
Exactly. Homeland Security is supposed to really do one thing. There's never going to be another 9/11. There's never going to be another big mass terrorist attack on the United States. And we've been pretty lucky so far. Have we had minor terrorist attacks? Yes. Have we had anything approaching the scale of 9/11 with 3,000 people killed? No. Can you have complete security, Abigail?
No.
And as I become more and more focused on security, what happens to your rights, do you think?
They start going away.
Your rights shrink. So we have this balance, and some people say we're not doing a good job with this balance between security and rights. The government potentially could lock this whole country down and keep us secure forever. But what would that take? Maybe taking away all your rights and freedoms. Okay? You know nothing different, but it used to be a lot easier to get through an airport and on an airplane. Did I give up rights and conveniences? Absolutely. Is it worth it? Maybe, maybe not. But it's not just this harder to get on an airplane thing you got to think about with your rights. We created this thing called the Patriot Act. It was a law passed by Congress, signed by the president. There's a lot in the USA Patriot Act. Do you like the name, the Patriot Act? Is that some propaganda right there?
Mm-hmm.
Could they have named it anything else? Of course. What do they call it? The Patriot Act, which implies what?
That it's a patriotic thing, that it's like, good.
Yeah. They could have named it, well, guess what, America, you're going to have less rights act. Is that like going to pump you up?
No.
The Patriot Act does. So there's a lot in the Patriot Act, but let's just know this. Your rights have been restricted under the Patriot Act. Law enforcement, particularly the FBI, now has greater ability to look through your data, your electronic communications. If they get a right type of warrant, which isn't a normal search warrant, they can even do things like go in your house and look around. Okay? So these police and intelligence agencies have the potential ability to read all your emails, listen to all your phone calls, turn your camera on and off on your phones, iPads, computers, see what you're doing, listen to what you're doing. Log your keystrokes. Know who you're talking to when. All right? And now pretty much every car is computerized and GPSs, so what else can they do? Follow you around, etc. Some people argue very strongly that this is a violation of our rights, particularly our Fourth Amendment right, searches and seizures. Other people say, hey, you want to be safe? You got to give something up. All right? So if we took the EOC, more than likely you get at least one question about the USA Patriot Act, and it would probably be something along the lines of, guess what? Figure out what kind of rights you may have lost and what kind of benefit or gain you got from it. All right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Patriot Act just ended, and it's got a new name, but it's still like a propaganda-ish name. It's, doggone it. I'll have to figure it out and post it again. But it's no longer the Patriot Act. Has similar things. It has raised some of our protections, but it's got a new name. Afghanistan. So, Al-Qaeda was based in this country called Afghanistan. President Bush calls the president of Afghanistan and says, hey, guess what? Al-Qaeda attacked us. Give us Al-Qaeda or we're going to level your country. The president of Afghanistan said, nope, we're not giving them up. If you want Al-Qaeda, you got to come here and get them. George Bush said, all right, fine. And we did. We went into Afghanistan. We basically destroyed the Afghan military. We started with CIA folks, special forces folks, joined up with people in Afghanistan who already didn't like Al-Qaeda in the government. Do I have the picture? Yeah. U.S. CIA agents and special forces troops joined these ragtag bunches of Afghans who already don't like their government and start attacking the government. The Taliban and the Afghan government is basically knocked out of control in a couple of weeks. Why? We're America, the most powerful country in the world. Great. We took over a country. Then you got to ask yourself, now what? And did we catch Osama bin Laden?
Mm-hmm.
No, not when we first attacked Afghanistan.
Well, eventually.
Eventually, 10 years later, Osama bin Laden and a lot of Al-Qaeda leadership fled across the border to the neighboring country called Pakistan. We knew it but didn't know it at the time, so we got a 10-year effort to try to find Osama bin Laden. So anyway, Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda is in the country of Afghanistan where he planned the attacks on 9/11. President calls Afghanistan up, says, give me Osama, give me Al-Qaeda. Taliban running Afghanistan said, nope, come get him. So we did, eventually. But the problem is, when you invade a country, is everybody going to greet you with open arms?
No.
No. And not all the Afghans did. Some were more than happy to have America here. Some didn't want us there. So what do? Start fighting against us. So now we go there really just to catch this terrorist group. And what do we wind up doing?
Fighting.
Fighting functionally 60% of the country, which is not good. And this 60% of the country, do they like train and put on uniforms and buy airplanes and tanks? No. They just look like a bunch of dudes. Blow us up with mines and bombs buried in the road, sniper type stuff, terrorist guerrilla attacks, because we're the most powerful country in the world. We could beat anyone, except that kid who digs a bomb under the road you're going to drive down, right? So we went into Afghanistan in 2001, and guess what? It's 2020. We're still there. We did wind up eventually getting Osama bin Laden. United States Navy SEALs, CIA agents, and at least one military working dog on these secret squirrel helicopters fly into the country of Pakistan, into where they finally found where Osama was hiding. They shot him a bunch of times, threw him in a bag, threw him in the helicopter. Fly him back to Afghanistan, take pictures, do a DNA test, say, yep, that's him. And then they flew him out to a helicopter. We dumped him in the Indian Ocean. We gave him a service and a funeral, videotaped it so people can know. But we dumped him in the Indian Ocean. Why did the United States make the decision to handle Osama bin Laden that way?
Well, I don't know why they would.
Why dump him in the ocean?
I don't know. That doesn't really make sense to me.
Is there a shrine or a monument you could go to for Osama bin Laden?
I guess not.
No.
But what if his body washed up somewhere? Wouldn't that be a problem?
I'm sure they thought about that. I'm sure they had him weighed down. All right, but so yes. And this is the president at the time and his key leadership watching the video of the raid into Pakistan. Of course, the president, his vice president, Joe Biden, who is what right now?
Presidential candidate?
Yeah, he's the Democratic presidential candidate. Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. She was in charge of the State Department and all our nation's diplomacy. This was the Secretary of Defense at the time. This was the chairman, Admiral Mike Mullen. He ran the military. And this is some poor Air Force general who's got to like run all the video cameras and all everything so the president can see what's going on. So yeah, took 10 years to get him, but we got him. So, we invade Afghanistan. As soon as we do, President Bush's advisors start talking to him and say, Mr. President, Iraq. What about Iraq? They have weapons of mass destruction. They have chemical, biological, and even nuclear weapons. Iraq is another authoritarian dictatorship. We fought a war and whooped them in 1991. They hate us. Iraq tried to kill his dad when his dad was president. They tried to assassinate him. So President Bush's advisors come to him and say, Iraq, led by this crazy strongman, Saddam Hussein, has weapons of mass destruction. What if Saddam Hussein gives Al-Qaeda a nuke and they get that in Los Angeles? Mr. President, instead of 3,000 people dead, how about 30,000 people dead? How about 300,000 people dead? Are you going to take that risk, Mr. President? President Bush decides he's not going to take that risk. So he calls Saddam Hussein up and said, hey, listen, Saddam, we're in a big fight here, and we're not messing around. This is not good guy America anymore. We have taken the gloves off. We know you have weapons of mass destruction. It's a threat to our security if you give them to terrorists. Here's the deal. You give us all your weapons of mass destruction, or we're going to come get them. Saddam said, come get them. So in 2003, we invaded Iraq. That's another thing we got to do, part of the initial invasion of Iraq. United States military, most powerful military in the world. Did we schwack Iraq's army pretty quick?
Yep.
Did we take Iraq over pretty quick? Mm-hmm. And what's the first thing we do?
Take their weapons?
We tried to. We looked for them. There weren't any. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So we basically attacked and took over a country to get their weapons of mass destruction. Turns out they didn't have any. So most people today consider this a fairly huge mistake on the part of the United States. But now we have another country, Iraq.
Why wouldn't he just say that?
Who? Oh, Saddam, yeah. Let's think about it. You're a horrible dictator. You run this country. You control it by propaganda, fear, your secret police. You torture your own people routinely and kill them. You fought war with your neighbor, Iran. You fought a war against the United States. You convince yourself the only reason why you're alive today and still have power is because people think you have nuclear weapons. Saddam was gambling on the fact that the U.S. was just bluffing, that they would never come in and take his country over. Why? Because Americans are soft, and if Americans believe that our soldiers are going to get nuked, and you have 70,000 dead Americans, we wouldn't attack. He gambled and he lost. So we destroyed the Iraqi military quickly. It was really over in about 2 weeks. And even we lost like 3 days because there was this huge sandstorm and everything kind of had to stop. We basically wiped out Iraq in 2 weeks, destroy its military. Saddam runs for it. He basically hides in a hole in a farm, but eventually, of course, America catches up with Saddam Hussein and captures him. We give Saddam to his own people who try him and execute him by hanging for all the horrible things he did to the Iraqi people. But now we have another country. And like in Afghanistan, at first a lot of Iraqis were like, hey, good job, America. Yeah, he was a horrible dictator, and he tortured and murdered lots of my family. Thanks for getting rid of him. But they keep waking up every morning and they're like, you guys are still here? When are you leaving? And then things don't get better, and the power goes out, and criminals start taking over, and terrorists start running around, shooting at people. The average Iraqi is like, all right, America, you're powerful, let's fix things. And we weren't fixing anything. So now the average Iraqi start fighting against the Americans, and again using guerrilla and terrorist tactics. They don't put uniforms on. They don't buy airplanes and tanks. They bury bombs in the road. They shoot at American soldiers as snipers, and it becomes a very brutal and bloody and terrible war, which lasts from 2003 really about till 2011. Oh yeah. And then we go back because these same terrorists turn into ISIS. Any questions on that?
Nope.
All right, so today we are not in this huge Cold War with a big, powerful nuclear Soviet Union, but we are involved in lots of small wars around the world fighting international terrorism. Still in Iraq, still in Afghanistan, places like Syria, North Africa, Yemen, the Philippines, fighting mostly the remnants of Al-Qaeda, and then this group that split off Al-Qaeda because they weren't killery enough, called ISIS, which of course you've heard about. And we're still there today. And there's no hint that it's going to end anytime soon. So yes, you and all you, if you wait a couple of years, you too can join the military, and you'll be climbing up the side of a mountain in Afghanistan or Syria or somewhere else, hunting down some of these same people who are doing this to us since 2001. Any questions? Lots of good videos. Of course, you don't want to hear all too much about genocide because it's terrible, but you'll learn a little more about human rights and genocide there. More on the Cold War, good stuff. Biggest thing that's ever really happened in my history. Two big things that I've lived through, of course, the attacks on 9/11, but also the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. And a little more about the, oh yes, the Patriot Act. It's now called, Abby, the Freedom Act. Propaganda.
It's ironic.
It's ironic. And then, of course, your last bunch of end of lesson questions. If you get stuck on them, don't hesitate to chat me on Teams. Last, finally, least, this is probably about 99.9% our last video. I miss you all. I continue to miss you over the summer. Please stop by and see me when you're big bad 8th graders. I'll still be right here. Have a good summer. Peace.